Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy. Okay, so today I'm very excited. I have with me Kiran Krishnan, and we are going to talk about everything that relates to the microbiome and also how that affects our health and what it really means to have optimal health in terms of the microbiome. Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy, and today I am very excited. I have with me Kiran Krishnan. He is a very well-known microbiologist, but let me have him introduce himself. So thank you, Kiran, for joining me today.
Yeah,
If you could just talk a little bit about yourself and why you became a microbiologist and what got you so interested in gut health.
sure. Yeah. So thank you so much for having me, Judy. This is a pleasure to get to talk to you and talk to your audience as well, and really get kind of nerd out on the whole gut science area, which is the area that I kind of live and breathe all day long. So I always knew that I was going to go into science. I've always been a big scientific nerd, even as a kid. I was always that kid that never took anything for granted. I always wanted to understand how things worked. My mother is a medical doctor, and I grew up in Malaysia and India. And I was always really fascinated by the work she did. So, in fact, I would sit in on procedures with her, like she would show me when she's suturing somebody up or fixing a bone or doing something like that. And it just always fascinated me. And so I knew I was going to go into the field of science with the hope of helping people to some degree. And how I got into microbiology in that field of science was the very first week of undergraduate in school. I was in the dorm and they were showing that movie Outbreak, which is actually quite relevant for now in terms of what's going on.
Right.
But that movie was with Dustin Hoffman and Morgan Freeman, and it was about a viral outbreak, right? This epidemic that was kind of starting to sweep through, and so that right away got me excited. I said, "That's what I want to do. I want to be a microbiologist studying viruses and bacteria, and I want to work for the CDC." That was my goal. So that's how I got into the study. And then as you start getting into the world of microbiology, it becomes so amazingly fascinating because you discover this entire unseen universe around you that impacts you in so many ways. But for the most part, most people are completely oblivious to it. And then you start to understand the power of microbes and how every one of our cells is actually an ancient pleiotropic bacteria. All of these connections, and it just becomes so fascinating. The information is so rich, and the amount of ways you can go about studying these things is endless. So it's an endless process of learning the impact. And then I focused a lot on what you would call medical microbiology. So there's so many different kind of microbiologists out there. In my area of focus was more on how microbes impact human disease. Right, so that was my big area, and I started with lots of human clinical trials and so on. And then when the Human Microbiome Project got launched in early 2006, 2007, that was an automatic, fit for me, because that was all about how the microbes that live in and on us impact our overall outcomes. So I jumped in with both feet at that point into the microbiome space, and haven't looked back since. Because the more and more we come to learn about stuff with the microbiome, the more we understand that the vast majority of our health outcomes are determined by the microbes in our system. And so it's a huge treasure trove of discovery waiting to be had to figure out the pathophysiology of disease. So it's such a powerful tool when we start to understand microbes and their impact. And when we can start manipulating them to some degree, how that's going to create so much alleviation of human suffering, I think. So to me, it's a really fascinating world, and I don't see myself doing anything else for the foreseeable future, because we're just at the tip of the understanding of the microbiome.
Right. I mean, I think the microbiome, the more I understand, it started with just a little understanding of kind of anatomy and physiology of digestion, and then, understanding the gut and how, like you said, the microbiome is so important. And as you're also saying that it's kind of a newer, topic in the whole, nutrition medical space. Maybe for the people that are listening, what is really the importance of the microbiome and how it affects us?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a really critical question, because that really puts us, or gives us, a new perspective on what we are, right? So we are Homo sapiens sapien is how we would define ourselves on the phylogeny tree, meaning we are a subspecies of Homo erectus, the cousins that we come from, and we used to think of ourselves as a collection of organ systems. So we've got a brain and a heart and lungs and pancreas and liver, and all of that stuff is connected by vascular tissue and connective tissue with the skin and this skeleton on the inside. And the thinking was that all of these parts of the body are controlled largely by the brain, and a lot of our metabolic processes and all that are controlled largely by our genetics, right? So we've got our gene code, and our code gives us all of our functions and all of our dysfunctions, and then our brain controls the function of all of these systems in our body. That was kind of largely the idea behind the human being, really. And so then the Human Genome Project, not to confuse that with the Microbiome Project, the Genome Project was about sequencing the entire human genome, right? And the Human Genome Project, the goal was to look at the entire human genome, and the assumption was that we would find a gene for every disease that we have to deal with, right? We're not talking about infections, we're talking about non-communicable diseases, right? So these are diseases you can't give each other, things like heart disease and cancers and diabetes and autoimmune diseases and all that. So the idea was that if you sequence the whole genome, we'll find a defunct gene for every disease that we get, and then there's got to be some way of manipulating those genes or what they do to alleviate disease. One of the first issues that came about when we did the whole human genome was that we really don't have much genetic material as a species, right? So we are a very complex species. We do tons and thousands and millions of chemical reactions every day. We do all kinds of these complex activities inside the body. We had estimated that when you sequence the entire human genome, we'd have somewhere around 200 to 250,000 functional genes. As it turns out, we've got about 22,000 functional genes. So 1/10 the amount of functional genes that we thought we should have to be a human. Then when you compare that to something like a rice plant or an earthworm that has 38,000 functional genes or 40,000 functional genes, then you start to really become confused, because how is it that we are so sophisticated, we're at the top of the food chain, top of the evolutionary ladder, and we have less genetic material than an earthworm, right? So how do we square that peg, that round peg? What is it about us that allows this complex machinery? So to give your listeners, if they don't understand that, a little analogy, it'd be like a supercomputer that can do billions of computations and run all kinds of systems, and then compared to just a regular old calculator, and then you open the calculator and the calculator has more chips and resistors and all that in it than the supercomputer, right? And then it leaves you a puzzle like, wait a minute, how is the supercomputer doing all of the work that it's doing? That's what we are. And so it left a big gap in the understanding of what in the world is actually going on. Then the Human Microbiome Project started about a decade after that, after the end of the Human Genome Project. And then we started seeing evidence that, wait a minute, we actually have predominantly microbial DNA in our system. We might only have 22,000 functional human genes, but we have over 4 million bacterial genes in our system that we use, right? So a lot of our activity, in fact, some estimates say over 90% of all our metabolic activity comes from microbial DNA and not even from human DNA, right? So it's absolutely fascinating to think that the way we are designed, most of our function comes from the bacteria and other microbes that live in and on our system. If we didn't have them, we would cease to be human. We would be able to do maybe 10% of what we do. So that's how important they are. And the even more fascinating thing now is based on the data that's come out over the last 10 years, and this has been the biggest revolution of science. So to put that into perspective, in the last 5 years, we've had 50,000 papers published on the microbiome, right?
Wow.
10,000 a year. That is an insane amount. There are huge topics in science that through the lifetime of the topic wouldn't see 10,000 publications. We're getting 10,000 a year on the microbiome, right? So that's how big the leaps in understanding are within the microbiome. And it's the job of people like me to like digest so much of that and really make the connections and understand what a lot of it means. And what we're seeing is that the vast majority of chronic illnesses that we deal with can be traced back to some sort of ecological change in the microbiome. So that is the impact of the microbiome. You can take almost any disease condition that people are dealing with, assuming it's not one that is specific for genetic defect, which very few diseases are, but the vast majority of chronic illnesses, 9 out of 10 chronic illnesses that we'll suffer from, come from dysfunctions in the microbiome. So that's why it's so important.
Well, that's so powerful. So, there, like oftentimes nowadays we hear about the gut microbiome affecting disease like leaky gut, SIBO, SIFO, even MRSA, C. diff, and all those. But it sounds like you're saying it's much more than that. Can you talk a little bit about how sort of, I know that I tell my followers all the time that, like 70 to 80% of your immune system is in your gut. And so if that's damaged, that'll affect how your immune system works. But if you could just kind of talk about disease a little bit and how, what roles the microbiome plays in them.
Yeah. So one of the big discoveries on chronic illness, so let's take a bucket of chronic illnesses that encompass 80% of the things that kill the Western population, right? So things like cardiometabolic disease, so cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, cancers, that bucket of diseases, right? So that encompasses literally about 36 different conditions and probably account for over 70-80% of the fatality rate within the Western population from disease. So just that area alone, all of those are driven by chronic low-grade inflammation, right? And chronic low-grade inflammation sets the foundation for the vast majority of those diseases. And chronic low-grade inflammation, the biggest source of it comes from the gut and comes from leakiness in the gut, or what we call, if we're going to say it more scientifically, we would say barrier dysfunction or endotoxemia, for example. And in fact, and these aren't studies that are peripheral studies. These are big studies done by the NIH, by the American Diabetic Association, by the American Heart Association. These are massive studies that are done by these massive associations. So let me give you one example of that. There's literally thousands of examples, but let me give you one. Diabetes. Diabetes is so important right now, right? Diabetes has always been important. But diabetes is projected to be the biggest global health crisis in the next 10 to 20 years. Right. And if you think about it, part of the reason is because when you become diabetic, then your risk for all other chronic illnesses double to quadruple. Right. So we're talking about risk for heart disease more than doubles. Risk for cancers can double to quadruple. Risk for dementia, Alzheimer's, autoimmune dysfunctions, and so on. All of those things increase dramatically. And we've got, somewhere around 600 million people that are diabetic in the world, and we have 4 times that number that are pre-diabetic in the world, right? So that is the part that's really scary, is that we have a lot of diabetics right now, but what's even scarier is we have 4 times that number in pre-diabetics who are going to become diabetic over the next 10 to 20 years. So at some point within the next 10 to 20 years, the estimation is that we'll have almost half the global population, or at least 1/3 of the global population diabetic.
Wow.
And all of those people have 2 to 4 times the risk of most other chronic illnesses. So it becomes a global health crisis. Then we paint the picture with respect to what's going on right now. The biggest underlying risk factor right now for a most serious side effect with this current pandemic is diabetes as well. Diabetics are 7 times more likely to die from the current pandemic infection than someone who's not diabetic of the same age. 7 times, right?
Wow.
So it is absolutely insane. Now, let's talk then about where is this diabetes coming from? Is it coming from just constantly eating sugar all the time and all that? Yes, that is a driving factor, absolutely. But the onset of diabetes, and this is published by the American Diabetic Association, comes from intestinal permeability. The low grade chronic inflammation that is driven by years of intestinal permeability. They put it as, quote unquote, the primary insult that starts the process of insulin resistance. And it does it in 2 ways. One is it targets the pancreas. So you start seeing the disruption in the pancreatic cell function. So it can't release insulin, for example. But the second way, and this is something that's relatively new in terms of discovery, is the causation of something called central insulin resistance. So what does that mean? Well, central insulin resistance means that your brain, the hypothalamus part of your brain that is supposed to be able to read your blood sugar levels, can no longer read your blood sugar levels. Even though your pancreas is working fine, it can produce all the insulin you need, your brain cannot detect what your insulin levels are. And so, and why does that happen? Well, endotoxins from your gut, from your microbiome, if they're allowed to leak through past your intestinal lining into the circulation, they make their way into the brain and they drive inflammatory damage in the hypothalamus of the brain, that it shuts down the brain's ability to read your blood sugar levels. And this is irrespective of body weight. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be overweight. In fact, more and more people are presenting with type 2 diabetes who are lean and perfectly of normal perfect body weight, right? So we've got this 2-pronged approach to creating diabetes through the gut lining and through dysfunctions in the microbiome that lead to the permeable intestines. And then you have the onset of diabetes, and then the onset of diabetes creates this huge risk for all other chronic illnesses. So that's just one example of how the gut microbiome becomes the primary driver of chronic illnesses, because you could stop that leakiness in the gut. You can stop that endotoxemia, or that leaking through of those toxins into the circulatory system, by just modulating the microbiome. And that could save literally millions of lives.
So then if someone were to be pre-diabetic, right, and then let's say that they have some of that kind of endotoxemia, some of that leaky gut, and then they decide, you know what, I'm just going to cut out sugar. And so would that, and maybe even incorporate some fasting, right? Because they say fasting can, heal some of the damage in your cells. So how does that pertain to the microbiome then? So, does it heal some of that, or?
Right. So just stopping the things that are dysfunctional to the gut won't heal it. We do have to provide the gut with certain tools. So let's talk about the parts that need to be healed in order to seal up the gut lining, right? So first and foremost, we need to increase the diversity in the microbiome. One of the key characteristics of a dysfunctional microbiome that leads to leakiness, endotoxemia, and all of the risks for chronic low-grade inflammation is loss in diversity in the microbiome. So that's the first part. The second part is we need to upregulate the presence of keystone strains. So there are these really important bacteria strains within your microbiome that are called keystone strains because they help hold up the rest of the ecosystem, and then they also directly provide protection against a large number of chronic illnesses. In the case of diabetes, Akkermansia muciniphila is an example, right? It's inversely correlated with diabetes, which means that when Akkermansia is high, you are protected against diabetes. When Akkermansia is low, you have a much higher risk of developing diabetes. So we have to get those keystone strains up. So we need increased diversity, which means more microbes, more different species in a more even type of setting within the microbiome. That's an important part, because you can have diversity where you have lots of different species, but the vast majority of those species are at very small amounts that they're really not functional, and your microbiome is taken over by a small handful of other microbes, right? So that proportion in their relative abundance is not conducive to appropriate diversity. You need to have lots of different species, but you need to have some degree of uniformity as well. So that's a really important part. Then those keystone strains like Akkermansia, fecal bacteria, we have to bring those up as well. When those two things are improved and adjusted, then the other thing that starts to improve is the production of certain postbiotics. And the postbiotics are essential nutrients and metabolites that are produced by your microbiome that we really can't get in adequate amounts from our diet. For example, short chain fatty acids like propionate, acetate, butyrate, valerate, and so on, or things like urolithins, like urolithin A, that are converted from polyphenols. These are all absolutely essential to the cellular functions at the lining of the gut, the cellular functions in your liver, your pancreas, all of the tissues in your body, and we need them to be produced from the microbiome. Now, once we have those things in place, then the microbes can start helping the healing of the microbiome. And it's really important to keep in mind that we do not have a way of healing our own gut lining, right? We actually count in large part for signals from certain microbes to be able to do that for us. And that's an important part, because remember, we have very limited genetic material, right? We have 22,000 functional genes. A lot of those code for certain pathways. Many of them code for just our physical characteristics, our eye color and skin color, hair and shape and all that stuff, right? So we don't have enough genetic material in our little genetic chest to code for every little thing we need. So we've evolved to outsource a lot of that function to really important bacteria. And a lot of those bacteria, if we're not getting adequate amounts of them in us, and we're not getting adequate exposure to them, they can't do that job for us. So I'll give you one example of that. The spaces in between the intestinal epithelial cells, right? That's those spaces most people have heard about. They're called the tight junctions. Yes. The tight junctions maintain that seal in between the cells, right? Inside the tight junction, the thing that controls the space are 40 different proteins. They're called claudin and occludin proteins. So they are the lattice, which allows it to open up should big nutrients need to get through, but then also closes it shut so that things like bacterial toxins and other things in the outside environment don't leak through. The expression of those claudin and occludin proteins are extremely important because cells on the intestinal lining will continually die off like any other cells in your body. And so when they get replaced by new cells, we need to increase the expression of those proteins so that things keep sealing up. The expression of those proteins, so far, we have not seen any mechanism in our own body for us to endogenously stimulate the expression of those proteins. We require signals from microbes that come into our system that actually stimulate the expression of those proteins, right? So the ability of our gut lining to heal itself is not just about taking away the offending things that seem to affect it. You also have to put in very specific tools to be able to start generating that process of healing. So just taking away certain foods, taking away certain chemicals, doing all that, that's better for your gut, and it will start to attempt to heal to a certain degree, but you have to work on those key parts of the microbiome, the increase in diversity, the increase in keystone strains, and just fasting alone is not going to do it.
So what are those how do we increase those keystone strains and the diversity?
Yeah. So, you mentioned fasting. So fasting will help to some degree. That's always a good thing. It's one of the things I do every single day. But really, it's about expanding the diversity in your diet, right? You want to start adding in some really unique things that you don't typically eat. You want to add in, if you're predominantly a meat eater, then you want to eat more raw meat as well. You want to get closer to raw meat, because here's one of the things. If you look at certain tribes, and we can talk about tribes like Inuit Indians and all that, one of the ways that they sustain themselves is they eat raw meat. One of the difference between raw and cooked meat is raw meat contains a lot of glycogen. So, and from the animals, right? So you're actually getting carbohydrates with your meat to feed certain types of bacteria, and then also increase your energetics as well. But on also eating connective tissue and cartilage and all that stuff, it provides you different nutrients. So you want to expand what you're eating if your focus is on meat. If you can start adding in things like roots and tubers and nuts, those kinds of things contain different types of resistant starches and all that feed and increase the growth of microbes in the large bowel. So that's a big part of it, is just kind of increasing what you're putting into your system. And if you have foods that you know are offensive to your system, stay away from them, which is fine. But you want to start trying to add in foods that will provide some degree of diversity. So one of the important categories is like urolithins. Urolithins are these really important compounds that are derived in the microbiome that affect mitochondrial function in your cells, that affect the regeneration of new cells and regeneration of new mitochondria. It also allows the removal of dead and dysfunctional cells. All of those urolithins are created in the microbiome from polyphenols. So you want to get like some flavonoids and things like that in there, so that you can feed those microbes and allow them to produce these urolithins, right? So that's an important part as well. And then a big thing is putting in bacteria that we've outsourced these functions to, right? When we started looking at solving the problem of leaky gut, we started looking at, okay, if we can't do it ourselves, meaning we don't have a system in our own body to go, I'm going to heal this torn up lining, right? Like we do with our skin. If our skin gets cut, there's a lot of indication that we can express certain enzymes and all that to start healing that skin. But we don't have that same capability in our gut lining. So we said, okay, we must have outsourced this function to bacteria that we would encounter in the environment. Okay? And so then we started digging into the research to see if there was any evidence of that. And sure enough, there was tons of evidence of that in animal studies. So they've been doing these studies on leaky gut in chickens and pigs and all that for like 60 years, right? So there's a ton of data on it. And we found that they found certain ubiquitous environmental bacteria, these spore-based bacteria in particular, that had the capability of going into our system. And then one of the key things that they do is they turn on genes to increase the expression of those tight junction proteins. They also turn on genes to start to increase the height of the microvilli. So they're regenerating actual length of your intestines, right? So they have all of these capabilities of doing this really intricate repair work on the gut lining. So we said, okay, that hasn't been shown in humans yet, but we presume it probably works the same way in humans because we are also supposed to get exposure to those same types of bacteria in the natural environment. So we published our first paper in 2017 showing that in a 30-day period, just by adding the bacteria, without doing any dietary changes, without removing anything offensive, like these are healthy young college kids, meaning when I say healthy, I mean they don't have any chronic illness, they're not on any medications, but they're eating fast food and they're drinking and they're doing all the stuff that's not good for you. And even then, we were able to completely seal up their gut, and we published a study in a major gastroenterology journal, and it was published as a frontier paper because no one had published yet showing that a bacteria can actually heal the leakiness in the gut in humans. So you got to get the bacteria in as well, and so people will say all the time to me, like, well, I eat more of an ancestral diet already, and I'm getting all the rich, healthy foods. So do I really need to add in a quote unquote probiotic? And my response always is, you have to remember that when our ancestors ate those foods, their food was covered in microbes, right? They didn't have sterilization processes. When our ancestors ate meat, when they ate roots and tubers and forage for things, they got dirt on everything. All of these microbes were teeming all over the food that they ate. And so they were getting a natural amount of these microbes with their diet. We're just not getting that right now. We don't get that because most of our food supply is sterile or sterilized to a certain degree. So it becomes really important to add back those really important functional organisms that do this repair work for us.
What's interesting is you just mentioned how, ideally adding in diets of maybe like the tubers, and you mentioned even connective tissue. And I've noticed that some of my clients, if they have like SIBO or they suffer with SIFO, then that connective tissue, because it has some of the I guess sugar chains, it kind of bothers their gut, and then they may have loose stools but from what I'm hearing from you, if as they seal their gut with getting these microbes back, essentially, these like histamine intolerances, which are again in the gut, would they be able to tolerate like a wider variety of foods if they were to work on their gut with the microbes?
That's exactly the goal. Yes, absolutely. Because so here's when you really dig into the course of human evolution, right? And you try to figure out, okay, how did humans kind of make their way to the top of the evolutionary ladder? We did so because we are technically omnivores, meaning we eat all kinds of different random things, right? And you look at human tradition from all different corners of the globe, they eat different things. And they have diets that are predominant in various different things depending on where they are. There's also lots of evidence on your microbiome adapting to where you live and where you eat, because your microbiome will help you adapt to those restrictions that you may have. One classic example of that is in Japanese people and the consumption of seaweed all the time, right? Seaweed is a very unique cellulose structure, and we as a human cannot break down the seaweed, the actual structure of the seaweed, for nutrient quality, because it requires this complex enzyme called beta porphyrinase. That enzyme is not made by the human system, and it's not present in most people's microbiomes either. But as it turns out, a study showed that the Japanese person's microbiome started developing the capability of making that enzyme to help them break down seaweed, because they eat it all the time in the form of sushi, right? And where did their microbiome pick up that gene? It picked it up from fish, because fish, their microbiomes have that gene. And then when you eat a bunch of raw fish all the time, your microbiome eventually picks up that gene so that you can actually now break down the food that predominates into your diet, right? So your microbiome has amazing capability of adaptation, like microbes do in general, to help you exist in whatever environment that you're in. So as a species, the thing that really gave us the cutting edge is when we became bipedal. So we came down from the trees at some point, right? And when we came down from the trees and started spending most of our time in the dirt and started walking, we became nomadic. We started covering lots of ground like other animals, and we started picking up lots of microbes and incorporating it into our system. And then in times of stress, the human as a species has the ability to adapt to eating lots of different things. For example, a lion is an obligate carnivore, right? A lion cannot eat a plant. The lion will die. It cannot assimilate nutrients from a plant. It can't eat roots. It has to eat meat, blood, and connective tissue. And so if there's a drought in the savannah and the lion's primary food source, the wildebeest and so on, their numbers are low, the lion is going to die off and get hurt. And then at the same time, that drought is also going to kill the wildebeest because they're obligate herbivores. They can't just go eat a dung beetle or another animal. They have to eat the plants that are there. And so the human, on the other hand, can dig and eat termites. We can eat roots and tubers. We can eat seeds and all kinds of crazy things and survive. And that has allowed us to have this kind of pliability and resilience within our microbiome to help us adapt to different situations. So the goal should be for people in terms of microbiome health is to have a degree of resilience and have a degree of adaptability to different foods. The easy thing to do and the effective thing in how you feel is to just kind of eliminate everything that doesn't agree with your system, right? And you will feel better, absolutely, because the symptomology of your body dealing with those foods is gone. But is that really helping you in the long term, right? That's the question we have to ask. And that's a question we have to address typically. In general, the human system does better with more things coming in and building that diversity over time for your gut. So my goal to people and my goal to myself always has been continuing to try to increase what I put into my system. And of course, keeping those things as healthy as possible, right? It doesn't count if you're like, well, I eat from 7 different fast food restaurants each week. That's a huge diversity. I got fried chicken yesterday, pizza today. No, that's all the same crappy food. We're talking about adding a little bit of diversity in terms of good food that enters your system.
What's interesting is, as we're talking about how we need to increase our microbes to have a stronger gut and then to have optimal health, a lot of times when we have the more serious gut overgrowth like C. diff and MRSA, and I think some other, maybe it was SIBO, sometimes they use antibiotics, right, to kill off this overgrowth. So what are your thoughts on that? And I know you mentioned that sometimes when we use antibiotics, it takes about 2 years for our population to kind of grow back. If you could talk about that, and why are we using antibiotics if our goal is to get more microbes, but if we're kind of killing off everything with antibiotics, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and if you think about antibiotics, and in many ways, antibiotics are amazing revolution in medical science. Obviously, it has saved thousands of lives over a long period of time. But the big issue is that antibiotics are completely overused, right? Even the CDC estimates that 50% of antibiotic prescriptions are unnecessary and often prescribed for things like viral infections and all, which the antibiotic won't help.
Right.
The problem is the perception is, in general, in the medical community, is that antibiotics do no harm, right? They're safe because they don't have toxicity of their own. Many of them have side effects that are very prevalent. But to the typical doctor, they're thinking, wait a minute, it's better for me to deal with the side effect of this antibiotic and take care of a potentially dangerous infection than it is to allow a dangerous infection to kind of kill the patient because I'm afraid of the side effect. But the reason is because that doctor doesn't understand the microbiome. They don't understand the long-term effects of what an antibiotic can do. Now, there are many situations in which I would be happy to take an antibiotic. If I was septic, if I had a bacterial meningitis and all that, I'd be like, doctor, give me all the antibiotics you can because I need to survive this, right? It's an acute problem. But but you also have to be really hyper scrutinizing the periods in which you use an antibiotic and whether or not it's actually going to be effective for what you do, right? So it's a lot of it is just a perception, and it's a learning curve for the medical community to understand that, wait a minute, this antibiotic actually impacts your microbiome, and that can have a huge breadth of long-term consequences that you cannot foresee now. Once that understanding starts to set in, I think we'll see a completely different shift in how people use antibiotics. And we're seeing that a little bit more in pediatric cases. A lot of pediatricians, and I work with a lot of doctors all over the place, a lot of pediatricians are recommending to their clients or to their patients when they give an antibiotic prescription to at least take a probiotic with it.
Okay, good.
So they've got that mindset. I would say at least 50% of pediatricians that I know and work with have that as an automatic recommendation because they're starting to understand that, wait a minute, this antibiotic does have long-term consequences, and those consequences are untold right now. We don't know all the different things it can impact down the road because it's impacting the microbiome. So we're going to try to give you something and say, okay, take a probiotic at least that can help. Here's another crazy thing about antibiotics. This is a study published from Johns Hopkins. They followed people who were studying, who were about to start a course of antibiotics, right? So people who were, discharged in the hospital and given a prescription for antibiotics, they would bring them into the study. They would get 1 or 2 stool tests on that individual before they started the antibiotic. And then they would get stool tests during the course of the antibiotics, and then they would do stool samples up to 6 months after the course of antibiotics, right? They were looking for how did the antibiotic change the microbiome, and is that change still apparent 6 months later? And they showed definitely the antibiotic had a huge impact on what the microbiome looks like right after you start the antibiotic. And then they also showed that that same dysfunction was detectable for 6 months after the antibiotic was stopped, right? So the impact is long-term. But here is the craziest part of that study. They also measured the gut microbiome of people that individual lived with, right, who were not taking the antibiotic, and they found that the people who they were living with, even though they didn't get the antibiotic themselves, they saw a very similar type of disruption in their microbiome.
Wow.
Because you're living with, and this was both platonic and intimate partners. So it was not dependent on having a certain amount of intimacy. It's just being in the same ecosystem. So there's something we call the microbiome cloud. We all share microbes all the time, right? There's many ways in which within a household we share microbes from our gut, actually, with one another, whether we want to or not. And because we're sharing microbes all the time, if one person's gut is compromised because of things they're doing, either medications or diet or whatever it may be, they do have a negative impact on the other people's microbiomes. And that is now documented.
So what about fecal transplants then? Is it that at a certain point people can't heal their own microbiome, so then it's just beneficial to get it from someone else? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so fecal transplants really kind of started as almost like a desperate last ditch move on someone's gut is so messed up, the microbiome is so beyond repair that that we got to just take a microbiome from somebody else and put it in them and see if it works, right? And it's worked really well for C. diff, for example. You get almost a 98% cure rate with C. diff using fecal transplants. There are lots of other cases, small cases like individual case studies on other conditions like colitis, and there's some on like neurological dysfunctions like cerebral palsy and so on. But the problem with fecal transplants is twofold. Number one is the donor selection, right? Because you are transferring so many features of that donor with their microbiome, it becomes really hard to select the right donor. So, for example, there was a very popular article that was published on a lady that had, I think she had colitis, really bad colitis. Now, she had been really athletic and fit all her life. She was actually a competitive athlete in certain areas, I think triathlons and things like that, but she always had gut issues. And her colitis was just getting worse and worse and worse over time. And so finally, she ended up getting a fecal transplant and from a donor. She didn't know the donor. The doctors or researchers selected a donor who did not have colitis or any of those kind of gut issues, so she got the transplant. It started improving the colitis condition quite quickly. So she felt great, but then she also noticed within the first 30 days that she started gaining weight. And she had never dealt with weight gain before. This was a lean, athletic person. And nobody in her family had a history of being overweight. And then over the next few months, she really battled and struggled with weight. And as it turns out, the donor was overweight. And so you transferred that really important feature to this new individual. Same thing with, cognitive disorders. You could be transferring anxiety, depression, mood disorders of many kind, eating disorders. So many things can be transferred if you don't do really proper donor selection. So that's the part that's really complicated, is that the microbiome is such a black box still of all of the stuff that it has the capability to control. When you take a microbiome from someone and put it in somebody else, you just don't quite know everything that you're going to be transferring. So there's an issue there. So in my view, our much better approach is about modulating your existing microbiome, right? Now, some people might say, I've had lots of courses of antibiotics and I was C-section born. I have no good gut bacteria at all. That's actually not true. What we tend to find, and we've done studies on really dysfunctional microbiomes and trying to modulate the microbiome, what we tend to find is most people have a pretty good amount of good bacteria in their microbiomes. What is off is the proportion of bacteria. It's called relative abundance, right? So you might have 100 species of really good beneficial bacteria that are very protective, but their numbers are so low because of overgrowth of other opportunistics and pathogens and all that, that they're really not functional. So it's about bringing that balance back within the microbiome. And remember, I mentioned, we share microbes all the time. So even if you didn't get some during the birthing process, if you came out C-section, throughout the rest of your life, you will get exposed to other people's microbiomes to a certain degree. And so there's a chance, if you use the right kind of tools between diets and the right probiotics and the right prebiotics and all that, you can really modulate and change the microbiome in a significant way.
So in terms of these prebiotics and probiotics, a lot of my followers are meat-based, and so oftentimes then when they, I know we've just kind of touched upon this, but they say that their gut's healed, right? So before going meat-based, they had a lot of bloat, just indigestion and all that, and then now they're healed, right? So they don't have any gut issues anymore after going meat-based. And I know you said some of it's just kind of maybe dormant, and it's not that it's really healed because we need the microbes from outside. If you can kind of talk maybe a little bit deeper in terms of just being meat-based, and then how maybe, is it that as with time, I know you said the goal is to kind of introduce other foods and then be able to eat foods that once you weren't able to tolerate, and that's true healing. I mean, if you could kind of delve into that a little bit more.
Yeah. So in general, resilience is true healing, right? So that's the key. People will say, like, people will tell me, "Oh, my gut is totally fine as long as I don't eat this, and this," and I'm like, "Well, that's not true resilience, right? That's not how the human condition is set up." Um, and we have to make sure we don't conflate, loss of symptoms to healing, right? Because the biggest problems in the gut, the low diversity, the leakiness in the gut, is subclinical. You actually don't feel it, right? So for example, in our study that we did in 2017, we screened 100 what we call healthy normal individuals. They have no gut issues at all. They have zero food intolerances. They can eat anything they want and feel fine. And yet 55% of them had really severe leaky gut, which means they had huge amounts of inflammation every time they ate food and went through the process of digestion, right? And so they didn't feel it. You don't feel that. So the leakiness in the gut and the chronic low-grade inflammation that you get from it, which becomes the foundation for chronic illness, is subclinical, right? So you cannot conflate the two of symptomology with how healed your gut is. We see this in the whole gluten side of things as well, right? So one of the questions I get a lot from people is, hey, I can't tolerate gluten when I'm here in the US. I know that if I eat a piece of bread, it's going to blow everything up. But when I go to Europe, if I go to Italy, I can eat the bread there and be totally fine. So does that mean that the gluten there is okay for me? And the response is actually no. If you're not tolerant to gluten here, you're not tolerant to gluten there. The reason you feel okay is because the gluten in Europe actually has a much lower concentration of FODMAPs, right, than the gluten in the US. So you're feeling the GI symptoms from the FODMAPs that are in the gluten. And then when you go to Europe and you're eating gluten there, you're not getting the GI symptoms, but it doesn't mean that the gluten starts driving huge amounts of permeability and inflammation in your body, right? And you might feel it somewhere else. You might feel it in your brain, you might feel it in your joints, somewhere else, but you won't feel it in the gut. So that's the part that's really important. We need people to make sure they're not conflating the idea of alleviation of symptoms and healing, right? Healing is a whole separate category of things that people need to affect. So ultimately, you need to provide your gut tools in order to be able to heal. The goal for people should be resilience. Your goal should be you're not eating this really strict, stringent diet where you can't eat a little bit outside this border. You need to be able to have some sort of flexibility. That denotes health. That means your microbiome is resilient. It can handle things you throw at it, and it creates the metabolic and immunological profile that is better for you long term. Because you don't feel the symptoms, it doesn't mean you're not getting severe leaky gut, severe inflammation. All the studies we've done on leaky gut, people do not have any idea that they have it, especially when you test it in the healthy normal, because it's asymptomatic. It's subclinical.
Okay. Everything makes sense what you're saying, but one thing is that sometimes our gut microbiome gets weaker from the foods that we're eating, right? So
Yeah.
what if we were to remove those foods? Is it just you're an advocate of more kind of like wholesome, real foods, and then having a diversity of that, and that's what will help our microbiome, I guess, flourish? Is that? Because I don't know if people will say, well, based on what you're saying, then I should be able to eat fast food like once a week and tolerate it because then I have diversity, right? So, I just want to make clear like what you mean by flexibility and diversity so that people don't think, oh, well,
Right.
What true healing is that I can eat anything and my body is strong enough that it can handle, and the lining will be sealed by taking all these probiotics, for example.
Yeah, so absolutely. It's good that you bring that up. It's all about having the capability of eating a broad range of wholesome, true foods. Yeah, it's not about tolerating a fast food, a bunch of fries and pizza and so on. That's not the resilience and tolerance we're talking about. And all those things all damage your system immensely, and those things will continue to actually reduce your resilience, because if that's your part of your diet, then you will feel that effect down the road. It will increase inflammation, increase permeability, and create dysbiosis within your microbiome. So absolutely, it's about being able to tolerate a broader range of actual wholesome good foods. For example, if you previously you couldn't at all eat broccoli. Broccoli was just too offensive to your system. You'd produce too much gas, too much bloating. It created too much symptomology. Good organic broccoli is something you should be able to tolerate. And so being able to bring those kinds of foods back into your system is really the key. So the basic idea here is when you identify good wholesome foods, and remember, we're taking all of the fast food category, all the snacky things, all that's out. We're not even calling that food, so let's not use the term food with those things, right? Those things are vices, right? So we're not talking about vices, we're talking about food. When you identify the foods, the categories of foods or types of foods that are actually offensive to your system, meaning you can't tolerate them, so removing them for a period of time is good. But just the removal will not heal your gut. That's the important part, and that's the part that functional medicine practitioners and all that are starting to understand. Even the really big names in functional medicine are starting to understand that just going through an elimination diet and removing offensive foods is not a process of healing. That is just step one to reduce the continuous damage, right? So you remove the offensive foods, then the next step is about rebuilding the gut lining and rebuilding the microbiome. And that's where things like probiotics and prebiotics and all that come in. They do a good job with helping your gut heal. Then once you heal, you want to slowly start adding back small amounts of those good, wholesome foods that you could not tolerate to rebuild tolerance, right? Because intolerance comes from two things, basically. One is the metabolism of those foods to egregious byproducts. For example, if you have too many bacteria that will convert certain types of carbohydrates to more gas, then that's going to make you feel more bloated and dysfunctional than the types of bacteria that will convert it into short chain fatty acids, right? Those are two different metabolic results of the same food. So it's not the fault of the food, it's the fault of the microbiome changing the result of the presence of the food. The second part of intolerance comes from your immune response to the food, right? You've now developed an immunological intolerance to the food, even though it's a perfectly healthy food. There's something about a peptide or something in that food that your immune system started to react to. And that is a dysfunctional part of your immune system, which is driven by a dysfunctional microbiome, because the thing that prevents that from happening is the upregulation of your Treg system. Your T regulatory system is supposed to identify these dysfunctional responses to foods and shut it down so that you can have more resilience and you can tolerate more things. But that upregulation of the Treg system comes from a very diverse, healthy microbiome. In fact, pathogens that are allowed to proliferate will bring down the function of the Treg system. Inflammation in the gut brings down the expression of the Treg system. So it's important to note that the two drivers of intolerance to foods is A, the metabolic byproduct of digesting that food, and that's purely dependent on the types of bacteria you have in your gut, and B, the immunological response to that food, which is also dependent on the types of bacteria you have and how well your regulatory part of your immune system is functioning. So the goal should be remove the offending foods so that you're not adding a stressor to the gut, then do the process of repairing the gut. And that process is things like, fasting can be helpful there, the right probiotic, the right prebiotic, immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins have been shown to have huge impact on repairing the gut lining and bringing down the inflammatory response in the gut. There are a number of herbal compounds that upregulate Treg. For example, green tea. Green tea increases the expression of Treg. So taking a EGCG type of green tea as a supplement really helps with the gut healing process. So there's a number of things that you can do to actually provide tools to repair that portion of the gut. Once your gut starts getting repaired, then you want to bring those foods back in at small doses so you can start building tolerance again.
So two things. One, how long does it typically take? So let's say I decide and I, take some sport probiotics and they're working well, and I take some maybe of the immunoglobulins. I mean, how long does it typically take for me to then try, some of these foods that I wasn't able to tolerate before? And then, the other question is, how do we know what probiotics are good, right? I mean, on the market, there's so many different kinds, so many different strains. I mean, like, how do we know which ones are the good ones, and are there different ones that are right for us compared to somebody else?
Yeah, that's a critical part of it. So I'll answer the first question part first. How long does it take? So in our clinical trials, we can show real dramatic changes in not only the microbiome part of it, but also the gut lining part of it in 3 to 4 weeks. So 4 weeks was a published clinical trial on leaky gut that we had. We showed in a 4-week period of just taking a spore-based probiotic, you reduce your leaky gut by over 60%. And to a point where all of the inflammatory markers associated with leaky gut also came down to normal levels now. So we were able to normalize the function of the gut in that short period of time. Now that's in a clinical trial. So if you extrapolate that to the larger audience, I would say that within a 6 to 8 week period of having this more narrow diet, so you don't have the offending foods in your system, and then you're using tools like the right probiotics and immunoglobulins and so on to repair, within an 8-week period, I would start trying to add in 1 or 2 categories and smaller amounts of foods. And remember, these have to be foods that are normal, healthy foods that your system just wasn't tolerating, right? So you want to rebuild that tolerance towards it. So that's the idea, like 6 to 8 weeks is a really strong amount of time of repairing the gut. The beauty of the gut is it repairs relatively quickly. The microbiome can change in a 24 to 48 hour period. When the microbiome changes, it can actually change the lining of the gut within 72 hours. So all of that stuff actually repairs relatively quickly. What you want to do is make sure that repair is more permanent and more affirmed before you start adding in things back into your system. So I would say give it 6 to 8 weeks for the most part. In all the clinics we work with, we have about 25,000 functional doctors, practitioners that we work with. On average, they do that kind of 6 to 8 week period. Now, the question on probiotics. The problem with probiotics in general, and there's a lot of problems with probiotics. The vast majority of probiotics really aren't doing anything in your system. The way I got into this whole business is I had a research company before this where I did clinical trials for nutritional companies. So they would hire my company. We would design and run clinical trials. So I'd done over 50 clinical trials at that point. And we also developed nutritional technologies for them. So companies would come to us and say, what is the best way to deliver CoQ10, or what is the best way to deliver this nutrient or that nutrient? We kind of do the research around the bioavailability and the uptake and all that stuff to really understand it. There was a large multinational company that came to us and said, can you help us figure out what's going to be the next generation of probiotics? This was about 8 or 9 years ago, right? And so we said, okay, we'll jump into the probiotic space, start researching it and understanding what all is on the market, what is the effect of all the things on the market, and what we think would be the next best probiotic. So we came into this completely objectively and started studying the probiotic market and the products on the market. And for the most part, none of it made sense to us. Number one, these crazy kitchen sink formulas, right? Like I would ask companies, what is your substantiation for these 15 strains at 50 billion CFUs? Like, why did you put it together that way? What do they do together? How do these strains work together? They have no idea, right? The only reason they did it is their biggest competitor has 12 strains and 30 billion CFUs, so they want to be a little bit more. There was no scientific substantiation with having 200 billion CFU being better than 100 billion or 100 billion better than 50. So all of that is just marketing nonsense of just escalating the dosing and trying to make it seem more potent and all that, right? So that right away we kind of threw out the window and said, okay, there's no real sense in just piling on a bunch of different strains. And most of them come from the same genus anyway. It's like a bunch of different lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. It's not like you're putting in a whole bunch of different genuses of bacteria. It's the same genus. And then just doing like this massive dose, right? So that was the first thing we threw out. Then the second thing is, I just surveyed health food stores, and I'd go into all these health food stores and I'd say, okay, what are your best probiotics? What are your quote unquote high quality probiotics, right? They would always point me to the stuff in the refrigerator. This is the highest quality probiotics. And they're live cultures, and it's really important to keep them live culture because that gives you the effect. And they would tell you, if you buy it, make sure you get it home and put it in the fridge. Don't leave it in your car for 2 days, and so on. And so then I would start to question them and say, okay, why is it in the refrigerator, not on the shelf? Right? It's 70 degrees in the store. What's the problem with being on the shelf? They would explain that it would start to die off if it's sitting on the shelf at 70 degrees. Then my next question is, how is it going to survive at 98.6 degrees in the body, right? If it can't handle this beautiful temperature in the store. And so they never had a response to that. And I would call the companies and ask them that, and they never had a response. So then we started doing the studies on it, we took 40 of the top brands of probiotics and put them through gastric simulation to see, can these even survive through the gastric system? And if they can't survive through the gastric system, meaning the stomach acid and the temperature is killing them, then we're just adding a whole bunch of dead bacteria debris into the gut, right? And so we tested them. 98% of them were completely obliterated to going through the stomach, right? So most of these probiotics are just giving you dead bacterial debris moving through your system. So that really frustrated us, and we started saying, well, what is then a probiotic? If these, what we call kitchen sink formulas and these crazy doses and most of these things in the refrigerators and all that aren't even surviving through the gastric system, what is a real probiotic, and is there such a thing as a probiotic? And so we started looking at just kind of evolutionary biology. What are all of these organisms that our ancestors would normally come in contact with on the day-to-day basis, just from living in the dirt, living in the environment? And then there's all these studies that show that the more you live in the environment, the healthier your microbiome is. There's studies comparing urban populations to farm populations in the same country. So in Russia, comparing the people that live in the urban areas versus the same people that live in farm areas, which are more rural, or rural areas in general, not necessarily just farms. And they found that people who lived in rural areas had twice the diversity as people that lived in urban areas, and had less chronic illness and had less GI issues and so on. So it became clear to us that there's something being connected with the environment that actually improved your microbiome in a significant way. And then we honed in on bacteria in the environment that could do that job. And the vast majority of bacteria in the environment will also die going through your gastric system. But we found these bacillus endospores that actually survive through the gastric system, and they can go in the gut and do some amazing things for you in the gut, starting with sealing up the lining of the gut. They stimulate that. And then sure enough, we found that, we said, okay, we found that these bacillus endospores are going to be the most important types of probiotics you can take because of what they do in the gut. Is anyone else using them? And as it turns out, in Europe and Latin America and parts of Southeast Asia, they've been using them as prescription drugs since 1952 to treat gut infections and upper respiratory infections and so on through the gut, right? So these drugs are still on the market today. So these have been in the market for well over 60 years as drugs and treatments, these spore-based probiotics. And so we started bringing them and using them in the US as a conventional probiotic. And again, we don't have to do anything through these. These are just, we grow them through fermentation. Once we've isolated them and identified the ones that really function in the whole human system, but we're not manipulating these bacteria or anything at all. They are exactly how nature created them, and they are really important symbionts with our system.
So then, there's so many studies on the lactobacillus strain and how they're so beneficial. So, based off what you're saying, a lot of those will die in the digestive tract, especially with, even the hydrochloric acid. So, why are those studies showing that they're so effective?
Yeah, so that's a really important question that we asked ourselves as well, because when you dig into the literature, you will find studies, right? So our question is, if it's not surviving, if it's not getting in there alive, is it doing anything? And as it turns out, in the microbiology world, in the probiotic world, there's this debate about whether those types of strains are even considered probiotics. In fact, the better term for them are metabolic response modifiers. And there are some strains. There are lactobacillus strains, bifidobacteria strains that have been shown to have really important clinical effect. But it's very specific to certain clinical effect, right? And it's very specific to a very specific subtype of strain. For example, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, the regular generic rhamnosus may not have any effect at all in the body, but when you take the Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG version, which is a very specialized subtype of rhamnosus, it does have a clinical function. It does improve upper respiratory health. It does improve antiviral function in the body. It has these types of effects. It does improve vaginal health in women, but it's the GG version that's specific for those effects. And here's the crazy thing. They also have studies on the GG version where they kill it specifically with heat and then administer the dead bacteria, and the dead bacteria still have that kind of effect. The reason for it, so they have all of these studies, published studies on heat kill versions of these strains, and they have the same effect as live versions, right? So it has nothing to do with those bacteria going in and living in your gut and creating a change. It's something with the outer cell membrane or some vesicle inside the bacteria that's released when they die that has a metabolic effect. The other thing that's true about those microbes is the moment you stop taking it, the effect goes away, right? So it's a direct metabolic effect by the presence of those bacteria. But again, those are very specific strains, and the vast majority of those studies are done with a single strain at a relatively low dose of 3 to 5 billion. There's almost zero studies on these crazy kitchen sink formulas where they just take a whole bunch of random strains and you look at the ingredient list and there's 29 strains on there in the back and the total dose is like 100 billion. There's no studies on that kind of approach. You can use these singular strains like Rhamnosus GG or Infantis 35624 or DDS1 for very specific effects, but that's what they're designed to do, is those singular effects. None of them has shown to be able to modulate the microbiome. And that's where we really wanted to focus on. We said the only way you can really impact health for the long term is by modulating the microbiome, because that's really where all the impact is, right? So that's what we focus on, the spores, because they can modulate the microbiome.
Sure. So let's say, I took the spore biotics for like 5 to 6 weeks and I decide, okay, I'm going to try the broccoli, and then I react. Does that mean that I need to take more spore biotics or maybe take a smaller dose? I need to cook the broccoli differently? I mean, what do you think?
Absolutely. So it's a dosing. It's an entire dosing system. So they actually have studies on this in immunization, in desensitization, right? They where people who have really bad allergies can go get those shots, right? Where they're giving you tiny titers of the allergen over time to try to help your immune system build a tolerance against it. So it's purely a matter of dosing. So a dosing of the offending food. And remember, it's not that you're necessarily reacting to it immunologically. That is one of the two responses. It could be just the metabolic side. You've got bacteria that are converting it to things that are causing symptoms. A great example of that is there are lots of foods that are really high in sulfates, right? Including meats, like including fish and things like garlic and leeks and all these things that are like healthy foods in general, but they tend to have high sulfate. So then if you have high levels of sulfate reducing bacteria in your gut, what happens when you eat those foods is those sulfates are converted to hydrogen sulfide, and that hydrogen sulfide is really inflammatory to the bowel and will give you diarrhea and all kinds of symptoms, right? But if you have low levels of hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, you'll get all the benefits of the food without that side effect. So it's about modulating those levels. The best way to modulate those levels is just keep increasing diversity, and then the microbes kind of modulate their own levels so that you have much more balance. So let's say in 6 weeks, you start adding in some broccoli and you still get gas and bloating, then I would wait another few days and then add in a smaller amount of broccoli, and you kind of dose yourself in very slowly and try to bring that food back in. We do that in clinics. We work with the people with, like, for example, dairy intolerance or intolerances to other categories of foods, and we try to bring those back in at a really low level to give them some tolerance.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift a little bit to mental health. I know that a lot of the nutrients to create the neurotransmitters are in the gut. If you could talk about how the microbiome affects the gut, it affects neurotransmitters, maybe even like mood and just mental health overall?
Sure, yeah. A lot of this is about balancing the what we call the sympathovagal tone, right? So that's the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic part of the nervous system, right? So your nervous system has this big section of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, and those are things that are involuntary. These are things that we're not doing on purpose. When we want to move our arm and contract our muscle, that's more voluntary, but the involuntary part has the two branches, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So let's think about what that means. So the sympathetic is like the flight or fight response. The parasympathetic is the rest and digest system, right? So that's just the general categories. So people that tend to be of elevated stress, who are anxious, who are depressive, tend to have really high levels of sympathetic tone, and they have lower functioning of parasympathetic tone. They also will have neurotransmitter dysfunction like dopamine, serotonin, GABA, all these important calming neurotransmitters that increase parasympathetic tone to be able to rest and digest. That's why, and remember, the rest and digest part is really important, because in that parasympathetic state is where you actually digest and assimilate food the best. So if you tend to be anxious and all that, you also tend to have gut issues along with it, because your ability to digest is actually attenuated because the parasympathetic system is not working. So you're heightened because of the sympathetic, and your digest system is also contracted because of that, right? So it goes hand in hand. Now, all of the neurotransmitters that are important for mood, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, all of those are produced predominantly in the gut. 90% of your body's serotonin is produced in the gut. The majority of your dopamine is produced in the gut. The serotonin is a happy hormone. The dopamine is a feel-good, like reinforced beneficial behavior kind of hormone. GABA, most of it is produced in the gut. The GABA is kind of the calming down type of hormone. All of those are produced in the gut, and then it's transferred from the gut directly to the brain and other parts of the body through the vagus nerve. So we've got this really direct two-way highway between the gut and the brain through the enteric nervous system, which is a neurological system that covers the digestive tract, and then that enteric nervous system is connected to the vagus nerve directly to the brain. So imagine microbes in your gut can produce neurotransmitters and send them directly to your brain, right? And there's plenty of evidence that shows that when your gut is dysfunctional, it has a significant impact on your mood and your cognitive behavior. A couple of examples of that. Campylobacter infection, right? So Campylobacter is the second most popular foodborne illness. It comes from contaminated chicken. If you get a Campylobacter infection, you may get diarrhea and all that, like you would normally think of food poisoning. But a very profound part of Campylobacter infection is actually sudden anxiety and panic disorders. Wow. That pathogen can produce compounds that create panic disorders in your brain. Right, and same thing with the class of antibiotics, the fluoroquinolones. That class of antibiotics, one of the known side effects of it is anxiety, because it kills off a good amount of bacteria, creating a disproportion. It increases the growth of certain pathogens that then produce their versions of neurotransmitters that actually make you more anxious. So it's directly connected. You cannot heal mood disorders without improving the gut, because the gut has at least 50% control of your brain, and the other 50% is from your brain. And the gut is considered your second brain for that reason. So mood disorders are intimately connected with the gut, and you cannot fix them without repairing the gut.
Wow. So, and what about addiction, right? Because I know it. If you can talk a little bit about, is it the same? I mean, because I know, a lot of addictive behaviors is kind of chasing that dopamine release. So is it similar? Okay.
Same exact thing. Yeah. So here's one thing I forgot to mention in this last part, is that leaky gut is a big driver of anxiety and depression, because those endotoxins that leak through, LPS in particular, right, that leaks through from the gut microbiome into the circulation. One of the things that it can do is it'll travel past the blood-brain barrier in your blood, and then it'll interfere with both dopamine and serotonin binding to receptors in the brain. So even though you might be producing enough of those neurotransmitters, you won't bind them effectively, so you still don't get their effect. So one of the things that's really clear about addiction is it is a issue of dopamine dysfunction, and a big driver of dopamine dysfunction is having a leaky gut. And that leaky gut doesn't allow even adequate amounts of dopamine to bind to its receptors. So absolutely. So because we're not getting enough of a stimulation, because not enough dopamine can bind to its receptors, we're constantly seeking that type of dopamine kick. And we don't have this really good basal level of dopamine in our system because we're not able to bind to the receptors. So one of the things that seems to help people with depression or even addictive behaviors is things like gardening therapy, right? So gardening therapy has been shown to be able to do that. One of the reasons is because you get into the soil, and the bacteria in the soil that actually improve your gut lining, then also stoke more dopamine and serotonin release, like Microbacterium embacae, for example, in the soil. So bacteria play a really important role in all of that. So you can think of a dopamine, addiction being very closely tied to gut dysfunction as well.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. What about allergies? I noticed some of my clients have taken, Megaspore probiotics, and they notice that their outside allergies, they don't get as many seasonal allergies. And then I think my second question is around histamine intolerance. And, I know that we just talked about how just eliminating foods will not heal and seal your gut. And so there are, folks I know that will consume meat, but they say, oh, I have a histamine intolerance. And so they won't eat certain meats because it affects that. Essentially, as we heal our gut, should we, one, be healing allergic symptoms, not only intravenously, but also just like seasonal allergies? And also, should we have less histamine intolerance, or is that, something related to your mast cells are dysfunctional, and so therefore you kind of have to live with it?
Yeah. So the first part of allergies is actually, that's one of the first things that we started to see when we launched Megaspore. When we launched it back in 2013, before we had our first clinical trials completed, we were actually just testing them on our patients. Or my business partner, Tom, has a clinic here in Chicago. So we actually took like 100 of his most difficult patients and just gave them the product and just to see what happens. One of the things we started getting reported back is people's allergies improving quite a bit. And I saw that with my wife as well, who had been taking things like Allegra, Claritin for most of her life for seasonal allergies. And then about 6 months or 5 months into the first time she started taking the Megaspore, then she'd just kind of forgotten and stopped taking those allergy medications. And then notice like a year later, well, wait a minute, I haven't taken these things for like a year now, and so then it started kind of putting it all together, and we started digging into the mechanism. And absolutely, the presence of the spores, so one of the things it does in terms of modulating immune response is it upregulates that Treg system, that regulatory T cell system, right? That regulatory T cell system is what builds tolerance to things. So you can absolutely, as you improve your gut, improve your microbiome, start to build better tolerance to things around you, like seasonal allergies, foods, and all of that. So absolutely, that's a benefit of the gut healing and improving the diversity of the microbiome process. And the spores really facilitate that in a powerful way. The second part of your question again was
the histamine intolerance.
Oh, histamine, yes, okay. Yeah. So the histamine intolerance. Histamine is a really interesting thing. Histamine, indole are counteracting kind of signals that are made by the microbiome. Histamine plays a lot of roles in the body. So one of its most important roles in the body is actually the stimulation of the release of hydrochloric acid. Histamine is the most powerful stimulant of the release of hydrochloric acid. And then, of course, histamine gives you the whole IgE allergic response as well. Another reason for histamine release and the subsequent symptoms associated with it is histamine is one of the ways that your microbiome signals to your immune system that there is a latent infection going on. So in the presence of latent viruses like Coxsackie virus, for example, it's been demonstrated that bacteria within your microbiome will release more histamine to try to signal to your immune system that there's a viral infection. happening. So histamine intolerance typically indicates a real dysfunction in your immune response and or the presence of a latent infection. You could have Epstein-Barr virus, right? Cytomegalovirus. These are latent viral infections that we picked up when we were younger, and many of us have it for the rest of our lives. And then when you go through periods of stress and all that, these viruses become more virulent. One of the things that is very clear is that these latent infectious viruses, when you are going through stress, they read your norepinephrine, epinephrine signals and become more virulent. And so during periods of stress, they might start to really replicate. And then in response to that, your microbiome starts producing more histamine to trigger your immune response. But then you feel all of that as histamine intolerance. So that histamine intolerance, when you bring your microbiome under control, you bring your immune system under control, should not be something you need to live with. And it's not always driven by mast cell activation issues. And even mast cell activation issues are not necessarily genetic. They are more the terrain, the ecosystem within your gut. And again, mast cells respond to allergic responses to things which are triggered by low tolerance, right? So all of it ties back to just this homeostatic way that your immune system is supposed to respond to the world around you. And a lot of that is dependent on your microbiome.
Okay. I heard a talk that you mentioned, when you go to the OBGYN and you get checks, how it disrupts your microbiome. It was kind of frightening to hear. If you could talk a little bit about that. And
Yeah, so the vagina is a fascinating place, as you know. It is not only from in cultural sense, but from a microbiome standpoint, it's a really interesting place because it's an ideal environment for bacteria to grow, right? So it's warm, it's moist, there's all of this real estate in there for bacteria to grow. But most women's healthy vaginas are predominated by one species typically. So it's typically a monoculture in a healthy vagina, which is a really unique thing. When you have an ecosystem or an environment that's suitable for lots of bacteria to grow, for only one bacteria to be predominant is a very unique setup, right? And so anytime you start disrupting that one bacteria and you start increasing diversity, the vagina is one of the areas where you don't want diversity in the microbiota. When you start increasing diversity, then you increase the risk for things like bacterial vaginosis, yeast infections, UTIs, and even infertility, right? Because the status of your vaginal microbiota dictates a lot your fertility capabilities as well. So one of the things that we started looking at about 5 years ago is what are lubricants doing to the vaginal microbiota? Because when they developed these lubricants, they had no concept of the vaginal microbiota, so they didn't develop it with the vaginal microbiota in mind, right? So there's all of these things within conventional lubricants like emulsifiers and all that stuff that we know has antimicrobial properties. And so our thinking was that are conventional lubricants actually destroying the vaginal microbiota? And I ended up working with a university in South Africa that was doing a lot of research on this, and they found that the vast majority of personal lubricants that they studied really harm the vaginal microbiota.
Wow.
One of the most egregious ones are the ones that you get exposed to at the OBGYN office. When they use that lubricant on you for the exams, it can disrupt your vaginal microbiota permanently from one single exposure. I was working with a professor at University of Maryland who's doing a study right now on intravaginal ultrasounds, right? And these are the wands that they stick in there for the intravaginal ultrasound, and they lubricate that wand and they put it in there. And what he's seeing is that a huge percentage of women that got even a single exposure see a measurable dysbiosis. In some cases, the vaginal microbiota never recovers from even one exposure. That's how tenuous the vaginal microbiota is. And then we think about like all these years that women have been using those vaginal, douches and the cleaners. Those things are devastating to the vaginal microbiota. So most of your lubricants that you can buy at the stores for social use, and then also the lubricants at the OBGYN office really harm the vaginal microbiota. So we have to be very careful with that. We're working on trying to develop a lubricant that does not harm the vaginal microbiota. We're still doing studies and tests on it. It's not a simple thing because all of the components that you need to create the functionality of the lubricant has some negative impact. And so we have to kind of rethink the process of making a lubricant. So my recommendation to people in the meantime, if you want a personal lubricant, is to use something like an organic extra virgin olive oil. That actually does not have a negative harm. Don't use coconut oil, because coconut oil will actually have really strong antimicrobial effects. And so it can kill off bacteria in the vaginal canal. I would use an organic extra virgin olive oil. And in fact, I've had lots of people taking it with them to their OBGYN's office and asking the OBGYN to use that instead.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and lots of OBs are open to it. They just need to lube up the speculum to get it in there so it's not completely uncomfortable, and it can work. The only thing we don't know is if they're doing a pap smear, if that's going to interfere with the reading of the cells, right? So outside of that, most conventional exams, I've had so many women send me after that program, the podcast, send me messages saying, hey, I took a little bit of extra virgin olive oil to my OB and she was happy to use it, and she feels better now. And so she's that's a very important thing to think about.
Can we talk a little bit about coconut oil? I know that you've mentioned that coconut oil, even MCT oils, may not be beneficial for the gut microbiome. It's such a revered food lately, with ancestral foods, the high fat in it. Can you talk about why it may not be like such a good fat and oil to use?
Yeah, and it's a combination of both the type of fatty acid and the effects that it has. Obviously, the lauric acid and all that are really strong antimicrobials. So coconut oils kill bacteria in an amazing way. They're powerful antimicrobials, and when you consume them, they will act like antimicrobials in your gut. So it's going to kill off more bacteria during the digestive process and release more of that LPS. Right? And because it has such a high concentration of fat, your body produces something called lipid rafts to go through the gut lining and pull that nutrient fat into the circulatory system. And because it's doing that, the LPS, the endotoxin, is also a fatty acid. So it accidentally also pulls in a bunch of endotoxin. So not only is it causing more release of endotoxin, it's also causing more absorption of the endotoxin beyond the leaking through. So there's a couple of studies now that are published of all of the sources of fat, and that coconut oil has the most endotoxic effect. So it's not just a hypothesis, it's shown in published clinical trials that it causes more inflammatory leaky gut than any other fat there is. And I think a lot of it is just adaptation to using it. And we mentioned earlier that your populations adapt. Your microbiome will adapt to the types of foods that are within your geographic region. And this is extremely clear. When they've done microbiome studies on tribes in the savanna in Africa versus Papua New Guinea tribes versus North Americans, Europeans, they find vastly different microbiomes in these people because of the different geography and the different foods that they have access to. So when you think about a coconut, the vast majority of people listening to this and watching this are of European descent, right? Your ancestors never saw a coconut in their existence, right? Coconuts are equatorial foods. They're around the equator. Right. So someone like me who comes from India and Malaysia and Southeast Asian countries, where coconut is really abundant in everything we eat and do, my microbiome is probably more adapted to dealing with it than someone of European descent. So that's an important distinction in the ideas. Maybe if enough Americans eat coconut all the time, the next couple of generations will be better adapted to it. But we do know that when you're ill adapted to a food, it can have deleterious effects, especially when it's a powerful antimicrobial.
And does the MCT oils, because a lot of people drink those coffees with the MCT oils, does it have the same effects as just true coconut oil?
So when I first started looking at it, my thinking was it may not, because coconut oil in itself has the long-chain fatty acids, and the long-chain fatty acids tend to be very antimicrobial. But now there's more data coming out showing that the medium-chain fatty acids also are powerful antimicrobials. So my guess is they probably would. Now, one thing that saves the medium-chain fatty acids is they are what we call direct oils, meaning they're directly absorbed into the system rather than done so through lipid carriers in a large fold. So they may reduce the amount of inadvertent bringing in of LPS because they don't use lipid wraps the same way as long chain fatty acids do. So my intelligent guess would be, and I have not seen studies comparing the two yet, but my intelligent guess would be that the MCT would be better, but it would probably still cause some die-off and some increase in endotoxemia.
Okay, let's go back to the conversation about the vagina. So, say that we use safer lubricants, but what about if I healed my gut and I have and my vagina is in good condition, and then my spouse, he doesn't have the healthiest microbiome.
Yeah.
Like, how does that affect me? And I know you were talking about the cloud, so if you can maybe.
It does. So specifically on the vaginal microbiota. So one of the things that they've seen before is that males can be carriers of dysfunctional microbes on the penis itself and continuously reinfect the woman, right? And the thing is, the males won't feel that dysbiosis because the penis is an external organ, and things don't overgrow on it to a certain degree because it's hard for things to overgrow because there's no moisture and so on. But then the woman will feel it because yeast and all that can really quickly overgrow in the vaginal canal. So absolutely, I think if his skin microbiome, if he is dysbiotic, he can keep reinfecting and causing dysbiosis to the vaginal canal. So I think that becomes really important to understand and keep in mind as well. And then absolutely, if his microbiome, his gut microbiome is off, that has an impact on the partner as well. Can the impact go the other way? Meaning, if your microbiome is really healthy, can you improve his? It seems like that direction of improvement is a little harder to do than the bad ones influencing you in a negative way, right? So it's almost like social norms. How easy is it for a bad kid, if you will, to influence a good kid into doing something bad versus a good kid influencing a bad kid and doing something good. So it's kind of that battle. I think it goes both ways, but it seems like there's more evidence that the bad microbiome can create dysfunction in the good. So one of the things I do talks all the time with in autism conferences, right? Because there's a strong connection between the gut and autism. And one of the things I tell the parents all the time, because parents who are dealing with autistic kids or kids on the spectrum, they are so hyper focused on everything around the child, the nutrition, everything about the child, but they're not necessarily taking care of themselves because they put so much into the child, and that's very exhausting to begin with. And so I remind them that if your system is unhealthy and you're not doing all of these good things for yourself and you're doing all for the child, you will still be a negative influence on that child's outcomes. So it becomes really important for both to be optimizing health in order to optimize the cloud that you guys both live in. So that, to me is a really important thing. If you've got somebody, your spouse or your partner or your roommate is really kind of egregious about their health and don't really care and they're not taking care of themselves, it can have an impact on you.
Wow. It's something to think about. As we are talking about the microbiome and how hormones even can get affected because of the microbiome, does amenorrhea have anything to do with that? Anything to do with the gut?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does, because you see it in women that are malnourished, right? It starts happening during malnourished. For example, I had a friend who was a fitness pro, and there would be periods of time when she's getting ready for a competition that she's really shrunk the amount of calories she's eating. She's getting like no fat in her diet. She's just eating one breast of chicken every day. And then right away, the first thing that goes is her periods, right? So she stops having a regular menstrual cycle. And when her body fat percentage gets below a certain level, the cycle goes away. And so all of that primarily gets affected by your microbiome and what your microbiome can produce for you to balance hormones. One of the important things to note about the microbiome is it is an endocrine organ. It produces all of the hormones that your endocrine system also produces, and it's a big part of metabolizing hormones. So, for example, estrogen. One of the important ways that estrogen is cycled, it's produced in your body, and then it cycles through your body, and then estrogen gets conjugated and dumped into your gut, right? And in your gut is supposed to metabolize, your microbes are supposed to metabolize that estrogen to get rid of it.
Right.
If you have low levels of estrobolome, which is a group of microbes that actually metabolize estrogen, then what can happen is you can get more of that estrogen getting reabsorbed in the gut back into your bloodstream, and then you can build this issue of estrogen dominance. And that estrogen dominance leads to all kinds of conditions, including higher risk for cancers and polycystic ovarian syndrome and so on. So that's all gut dependent of what's living in your gut. So absolutely, and anything with hormones, anything with cycles, the microbiome plays a really definitive role in that. And the thing is, it's really hard right now to go and specifically manipulate different parts of the microbiome, right?
Right.
We just don't know enough about it to be able to push very specific buttons. The thing that is uniform across everyone's microbiome is two things are really important for overall health: diversity in the gut microbiome and the presence of keystone strains. If you have those two things, then your gut microbiome is much healthier and you tend to be much more healthy. So all of those things we talked about, all the little finite influences of the microbiome, are impacted in a major way by having higher diversity and also having high levels of keystone strain. So if you can just work on those, it's really critical. So we develop tools for that specifically because it's hard for people to do that just through lifestyle, right? We know that there's no evidence that elimination diets increases diversity or keystone strains. We know that, like going straight vegetarian or going straight vegan or doing whatever extremes of diets we want to talk about, we don't have evidence that those things impact the population of bacteria enough. So we said, okay, can we produce tools to actually help people do that with whatever diet system that they're trying to use to help make them feel better and improve their symptomology. So we published a study in August of last year showing that when you combine the spores in Megaspore with the oligosaccharide-based prebiotic, it's called MegaPre, when you add the two of them together into your system within a 3-week period, we increased the diversity of the microbiome by over 35%, which is a huge increase in the sea of microbes. And then we increased the growth of these keystone strains between 100 to 1,000 fold. Not 50% or 100%, not doubling it, 100 to 1,000 fold increase in the population of the keystone strains in just a 3-week period, right? So that can be really powerful when you bring that along with the diet and things that you're doing, the lifestyle changes to eliminate things that are offending your system at the moment.
As we're also talking about hormones, what about weight gain and appetite?
Mm-hmm.
How does the microbiome affect those areas?
Yeah, so the microbiome controls the vast majority of it. So the two studies that we have actually that show that quite distinctively. Number one, the microbiome controls the release of ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. It also then controls the trigger for the release of leptin and adiponectin, which are your satiety hormones. It also controls the release of cyclic AMP, which is the important signal to increase all your cells' uptake and utilization of fatty acids for energy, right? So if you want to become a fat burner, a big aspect of fat burning is the increase of AMP kinase, and that AMP kinase increase comes from signals from the microbiome. In particular, things like butyrate and propionate and acetate, so short-chain fatty acid. So I'll give you an example. In our first leaky gut study, one of the things we studied were metabolic hormones. And these are not in overweight people. These are normal body weight people. Mm-hmm. And yet we saw all of these dysfunctions in metabolic hormones. Ghrelin being one of the main ones that we saw. Ghrelin, for your audience that's not familiar, is your hunger hormone, right? Your body, your brain stimulates, sends a signal to produce the ghrelin, and then you release ghrelin into your system to make you feel hungry so that you're motivated to go and eat, right? So when you're fasted, ghrelin levels will be high. That's where you feel the gurgling in the stomach, the hunger pangs, and so on. That's where ghrelin comes in. Now, when you eat food, what is supposed to happen is you're supposed to get a signal from your microbiome to your brain that says we have enough calories coming in, bring down the production of ghrelin. We don't need the hunger hormone anymore, right? What we saw in our study, and these are in normal weight individuals, like when they would come in there fasted, the ghrelin levels would be this high, and then we would give them a 2,000 calorie meal, and the ghrelin levels would barely drop from that fasted state, right? And then ghrelin levels within the next 2 to 3 hours will start to creep up again. And that is ghrelin and leptin resistance. That is the foundation for metabolic syndrome and obesity. And so we saw after 30 days of the probiotics, they would come in faster with ghrelin levels here, we'd give them a meal, and then ghrelin levels would drop more than 50%. So we're restoring the communication between the gut and the brain, where the gut is able to tell the brain, hey, we have enough calories coming in, stop producing the hunger hormone. In fact, increase the production of the satiety hormone so we can start metabolizing this food, balancing the blood sugar levels, and turning on fat burning. We also just finished at the end of last year what I call metabolic reprogramming study, right? So the idea behind the study was, we all know that person that can eat whatever they want, never gain weight, right? You might be one of those people. And so those people, we always said, well, they have a high metabolism, as if they just burn more calories from walking and talking and breathing like everyone else would, but they burn higher levels of calories. Well, actually, it turns out from microbiome studies that it's not about their metabolic rate. It's more about the types of microbes that they have within their system. So their body engages the absorption of calories differently than other people who struggle with weight, right? So I had a hypothesis that if we just manipulated the microbiome without doing any dieting at all, we should start to see weight and fat loss in individuals and improvements in metabolic health. And this is in overweight individuals, right? So we did a 90-day study where all we gave them was 2 probiotic strains, so the spores, and then we gave them 1 prebiotic, about 800 milligrams of a prebiotic, a very low level of prebiotic. That's just enough to start manipulating the microbiome. In a 90-day period, and these are obese individuals who are not doing any exercise, they are eating exactly how they normally eat. They're eating their chips and fast food and all that. In a 90-day period, just by adding those 2 things, we saw almost a 40% reduction in visceral fat mass.
Wow.
No diet, no exercise, right? Absolutely fascinating and mind-boggling to us. We were hoping to see that, but it was really shocking to actually see it. And then all of the inflammatory markers associated with being overweight started to come down. Sugar metabolism markers improved quite significantly. So we're seeing this complete shift in their metabolic profile while they're still sitting on the couch eating the foods that made them gain weight in the first place. So then think about when you do this metabolic reprogramming using probiotics and prebiotics, and then you add a diet component to it, right? Where you're actually improving your diet and improving what you eat, and you're doing a little bit of exercise, you would completely change your metabolism. And so that's the idea. So yes, absolutely, the long way to answer your very straightforward question of, does the microbiome impact metabolism? It's absolutely, not only does it impact, it controls your metabolism in large part. Because remember, we have very few genes in our system to do much of anything. We have outsourced all of that metabolic control to the microbes that live in our gut, because they get first look at what's coming into the system, and they can see and decide what's in there, and then help your body signal to the brain to respond metabolically to what's coming in.
In the 90 days that they were, that they lost weight, did they start eating like less calories at all? I mean, maybe they didn't change their diet, but do you know if they ate less because maybe their ghrelin and leptin were working better, so then they felt satiety faster?
Yeah, so an interesting aspect of that, we didn't do a very detailed food diary because we found that to be really hard to have accurate data from that. People just don't fill that out very accurately. You forget, and then you go back and you might try to fill it out from memory, and then that data is all corrupt. So we just kind of asked them, and they didn't know who was on placebo, who was on real treatment. So we were asking them, and in general, what we heard was from the people that ended up getting on the probiotic and prebiotic, that they felt full faster. That whole ghrelin satiety part of it, I think, is a big driver. So that's the general response that we got, and I think that inevitably makes them eat a little bit less, right? Whether they want to or not, right? Everybody has a full point, right? In the Western world, most people overeat. We eat well beyond the satiety portion. I still do that as well, and I try to keep a healthy body weight. But if it's a food I really like or something that tastes really great, I will eat overboard, but I still have a limit. There's a place where I will stop, where I'm like, all right, I don't even want to look at this food anymore. That limit comes down a little bit. When that limit comes down a little bit, the overeating reduces, and that in itself can have a huge impact. But a lot of it is just changing how the hormones respond too.
So what about cravings? They say that sometimes, depending on the bugs that you have in your microbiome, it'll cause certain cravings. What is your take on, why do we have certain cravings? Is it really because of a nutritional deficiency? Is it because we're just addicted to sugar and we want these sugary foods? Like, what do you think it is?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is there's two parts to it. So there are pathogens that love sugar, for example, and they will send neurotransmitters into your vagus nerve directly to your brain to try to get you to eat more sugary foods, right? So fungus is good at doing that. Candida, for example, if you have a lot of candida, you may get a lot more sugar cravings because that species actually likes sugar and does well in the presence of sugar. So that is one of the ways that you'll end up craving those things. Now, when you look at people like pregnant women, they get all kinds of weird cravings throughout the pregnancy. That is more their microbiome telling them the types of things to eat. Like, for example, I've known women that almost never eat meat, and then all of a sudden they're craving hamburgers, right? And so the thing that's important with the craving aspect of it is our microbiome is trying to tell us a signal, but because of our experience around food, we translate the signal to particular types of food, right? So your microbiome might be saying, I need more protein. And our brain translates that to hamburger because that's what we associate protein with. And so what we end up craving will differ from person to person based on our social experience. But it is absolutely the case that the microbes are giving you that neurological stimuli. And it can be both. It can be for stuff that you actually do need, or it can be something more egregious, like the fungus is telling you that it wants more sugar to help itself, right? It's hard to distinguish one from the other. So, but it is a natural expectation, I think, if you switch your diet all of a sudden, and now your diet is predominant with fat and protein, and you're not getting a lot of carbohydrates, the carbohydrate requiring bacteria are going to signal to you that they want more carbohydrates. In your case, you might interpret that signal as a donut, right? Because that's the most salacious kind of carbohydrate you can think of. Very few people salivate over celery, even though that's what you want. But your brain is making you think of a donut because that's the kind of thing that you would salivate over.
And likely what will motivate you more to go and get it.
Exactly. That's the motivation, right? Even though what you really need is like some broccoli or some celery or something, a small amount of it, your brain is translating that to cupcake, because that's what will motivate you.
So what about fermented foods? I hear, a lot of people are like, it has the great prebiotics, but some people with, for example, candida or some overgrowth, those opportunistic yeast will kind of feed off of the prebiotics or the fermented foods too. So what is your take on these fermented foods?
Yeah, so in general, fermented foods are good for your system. They are like partially digested foods that are loaded with all kinds of active ingredients, organic acids and peptides and vitamins and all that are readily absorbable and in fact feed lots of bacteria within your system. They will get some histamine production, though. They will get some sugar production. Those kind of things do occur within fermented foods, and so it can impact how your body tolerates it. For the most part, it's beneficial if you can find a fermented food that you tolerate well. It will help your microbiome. That's a positive thing. But for the most part, you should make the ferments yourself, right? The problem with commercially bought fermented things like most kombuchas is, in order to do it at a commercial scale and make it affordable and cheap, they're going to cut a lot of corners, right? And they're just going to reinforce things with sugar and flavoring and all that stuff. So it's not going to give you the same thing as making a simple fermented sauerkraut in your house or fermented fruit thing in your house. Just doing that in itself can have a positive impact on you. So if you find a fermented food that you are tolerant of at the moment, it can definitely help your microbiome.
What about sweeteners? I've seen some studies where even stevia maybe doesn't impact your glucose but affects your insulin.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on sweeteners and the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so one of the largest review papers on sweeteners had some really strong trends, but we can't quite say it's conclusive just yet because it's hard to know what exactly many of these categories of sweeteners are doing. Now, there are the polyol sweeteners, things like xylitol, that have actually shown to improve the microbiome, right? So those actually have more prebiotic quality than anything else. And then you've got all the artificial sweeteners, the saccharins and aspartames and all that, that seem to be clearly deleterious to your microbiome. So what they've shown is they can increase the growth of certain types of pathogens like Clostridia or certain Prevotella. They can impact the Bacteroidetes ratio, and then they can create dysfunction in sugar metabolism. But like you said, more on the insulin response side of things, because the microbiome really is such an important part of your metabolic or your hormonal response to food. And so if you're putting something in there that has a negative effect on the microbiome, it will have an overall negative impact on how your body responds to the food. There's some clear studies that show that long-term use of sucralose actually has more impact on obesity and diabetes than sugar itself. Right. And so I would say that anything that is unusual for your microbiome, we have not evolved to consume it, is going to have a deleterious effect on your microbiome. And that's part of that adaptation that we talked about, right? If your microbiome is not really adapted to consuming these things, it'll likely have a negative impact on your microbiome. And artificial sweeteners in particular are really culprits of that. I think on the microbiome level, they're doing things that really have an impact on your metabolism and your hormones, and it's hard to study it just yet, but there are lots of studies going on right now.
So then with that same kind of mindset of, these kind of sweeteners are a little foreign to the microbiome, which may not then be beneficial. I mean, what about plants that are, we are kind of, not just even GMO plants, but even like organic plants that we use a lot of these, natural herbicides. I mean, if we are consuming a lot of like toxins as we are raising these plants, I mean, are they also causing harm on our microbiome, even though we're trying to get diversity?
Yeah, and they likely are. That's the unfortunate thing about the whole agricultural picture in itself, is that that's the bad and the good with plants, right? You're going to get some degree of chemicals coming in. The problem is we also see that in meats as well, right? And because these chemicals are so ubiquitous in our society, and the animals that we're eating are eating plants and eating agriculture. So, and the water system is covered in it. I think if we can really try to avoid the most egregious of them all, like the Roundups, we're making a significant improvement. And then one of the things I was really promoting over the last couple of years is just some of your own gardening. Let's say you are more focused on a carnivore diet, but then you realize, okay, I need to get some plant-based foods in my system. I'm just going to grow some cucumbers and some celery and a couple other things in my own garden. So you're not putting things on it. You have control over what's happening. And that becomes your consumption of plant-based foods. That is a much better controlled environment that'll give you the benefits of the plant-based foods and yet dramatically reduce your exposure to those herbicides and pesticides. And then, of course, the meats that you eat have to come from ultra-clean sources as well, because these poor animals that are eating agricultural products with Roundup all over it, all of that stuff concentrates in their fat and their toxins, and so you have to be really scrutinizing where your meat comes from as well. And fortunately now there's lots of areas that have great co-ops with local farmers that are raising meat in the cleanest of ways that you can in our environment, where you can actually get shipments of meat and so on to your house, right? I'm sure you talk about that a lot, but there are ways of getting cleaner food. I would say if you're really concerned about plant-based foods and the toxins that come in it, grow 2 or 3 things at home and make that a basis of your plant-based intake.
Yeah, one thing that's really interesting is during this pandemic, I've heard that a lot of people are starting to grow in their garden because
Mhm.
we don't have access to the grocery stores as much, and so plants and vegetables, they go bad pretty quickly compared to meat. And then people are starting to grow in their own backyard, especially because they have more time. They need to get the vitamin D, so it's good. I think I agree with you. I think no one needs to be just meat based if you don't have to. It's most people that are really sick that they have kind of like nothing else left, and so they choose to try meat based, and then they feel better. But I think this takes it one step further, and it's not just being asymptomatic, but it's also healing the gut, right? Making
Yeah.
sure that then maybe you can eat other foods because it just reminds me of one client I had. He would only eat grass-fed, grass-finished meats because that was the only meats that would not cause his anxiety to skyrocket
Right.
and other things. And he was only in his 20s, and he's like, I'm just gonna live like this forever. So I'm just gonna eat grass-fed fit. And I'm like, well, what if you ever want to go out or travel? Like, you can't do that. You have to heal your gut because that means that you can't even ever go to like Europe and eat the meat
Mhm.
there. It's grain finished, right?
Yeah.
So it's I'm really glad you're talking about all of this. So going back to probiotics, I hear a lot of times that the three main kind of species is the spore biotic, the lacto, and I think it's the bifido, but it's having a blend of those three and a variety, and then kind of taking them on and off. There's all these like titration schedules. It
Mhm.
seems a little complex. If you could kind of break it down for people, like what is the best way to take probiotics? Do we need to take all these different strains? Do
Yeah.
we need to take it forever? That type of thing.
Yeah, and the way we answer that question is we really look at what happens in the natural environment, right? What is our relationship with bacteria in the natural environment? And most of the relationship with the bacteria is just the stuff we would encounter frequently in the ecosystem. And our ancestors throughout the course of human evolution didn't have all of these specific ways of introducing bacteria in their system, right? Like, I'm going to do this bacteria for a while and then switching to this and that. So we're trying to make it as complementary to what we are evolved to do as we possibly can. So the whole cycling through different probiotics and all that stuff is just stuff that people came up with. There's no scientific basis for any of this stuff. Nobody's ever done a trial on it. Nobody really understands what any of that is doing in their system. It's just kind of stuff people came up with. And the nature of all of this online information sharing is this stuff gets shared and shared and shared and becomes dogma, right? Just because everybody's saying it, even though there's no basis for it. So basically what we are seeing is that if you get adequate exposure to outside bacteria, so let's say you're lucky enough where you do have trails and things you can go out and spend time in natural environments, that in itself has a really positive impact on your microbiome. And then if you can eat certain categories of probiotics, like the spore-based probiotics, that in itself does all of these wonderful things for your microbiome. Then you don't have to think about it beyond that, right? So beyond that, it's just like your diet, your food, your lifestyle choices. So when it comes to probiotics, we wanted to really simplify it and said, there's really two ways that you get adequate exposure to bacteria. One is by going outside, going to natural environments, and taking your spores into your system, just as our ancestors would have taken them in through the foods that they ate. Just doing those two things alone has a huge impact on your microbiome that you don't necessarily need to think about it beyond that. So that's a simplified version.
I know that microbiome carries Restore Flora, and I think there's like one strain that's similar to Megaspore. But is there a benefit in taking both the Megaspore and the Restore Flora?
Yeah, so the reason we developed Restore Flora, so Restore Flora has two of the spores that are found in Megaspore, but it also has Saccharomyces boulardii,
Okay.
Which is a fungal probiotic, right? And that's a natural organism that you would come in contact with in the natural environment. It has lots of positive effects in the gut. One of the areas that it really has good studies on is antibiotic-associated diarrhea. So we developed that product in particular at a request from a bunch of nursing homes who have patients that have chronic diarrhea. They're on antibiotics all the time and they're just having loose stools nonstop. So we developed this product, which has helped them quite a bit. And then we started offering it to functional medicine as well. The reason why you would take both is if you are on a course of antibiotics or you've recently been on a course of antibiotics. Outside of that, just the Megaspore alone is plenty fine.
Okay. And so as we're coming to a close, if people are like, okay, I'm going to try to, heal my gut, I want to work on it, I have, some of the allergies, some of gut dysfunction, whatever it may be. Would you say that, what would you say would be kind of like the first few steps? It sounds like you're saying outdoors, Megaspore, maybe doing an initial elimination diet and then maybe bringing it back. But is there anything, you want to add to that, or is that kind of a good summary of like starting to heal the gut?
Yeah, and that I think we just want to reiterate that absence of GI symptoms does not equate healing the gut, right? So those are two separate things. I think that's a really important thing for people to note. I think if you can eliminate foods that then alleviate symptoms, that's a good thing. That means you're not continuously putting pressure on the lining of the gut and the immune system in the gut. So it gives you an opportunity, a window, if you will, to heal. But then you have to bring in the tools. So some of the most important things is just starting with the spores. And that's why when we developed the technologies that we use, we started with the spores and did the study just with the spores to see if all you did was take the spores, will it be enough to heal the gut microbiome and the lining? And it absolutely does. And we have the published studies to show it. And so once you've gotten your diet to a point where you can tolerate everything that you're eating and you're feeling pretty good from a GI standpoint, then you start adding in the spores. And then about 4 or 5 weeks of adding in the spores, we encourage people to start adding in some prebiotics and particularly oligosaccharides. So we developed this prebiotic product that we call a precision prebiotic because it specifically feeds keystone bacteria in your large intestine. Remember the importance of keystone bacteria that we talked about. These are oligosaccharides that target those keystone bacteria. So then the second month, the first month, once you've eliminated things down, the first month you start with a probiotic. Second month you're adding in the prebiotics, so you're on the probiotic and prebiotic. And then by the end of that second month, you should really have made huge leaps and bounds in improving the leakiness in the gut and the immune system in the gut. Now, you will feel that in different parts of the body because the thing is, you might have alleviated your GI symptoms, but you still have anxiety, you still have skin issues, you might still have other issues that are driven by the gut, but you don't feel it primarily in the gut, right? So those types of things will start to improve significantly. There's a couple other products that have become really important when we talk about people that have real severe damage long-term to the gut that really help is that IgG, the immunoglobulin that comes from bovine serum. It's a high concentration IgG. It's really effective for people with real inflammatory conditions in the bowel to start resetting the immune response and supporting the rebuilding of that part of the gut. And then a new one that we launched is a Mega Omega. I don't know if you've seen that product, which is a high EPA fish oil, because what we found was that one of the main parts of the inflammatory cascade that's triggered in the gut is called the arachidonic acid pathway. That pathway is triggered by damage to the tissue in the lining of the gut. Just like if you get damage to the tissue on your skin or anywhere on your body, the cyclooxygenase and lipooxygenase, called the arachidonic acid pathway, would trigger to give you inflammation and pain to signal that something is wrong with that part of your body. It's the same exact signals in the gut, and it's a big driver of inflammatory response, not only in the gut, but systemically as well. So we found that certain types of fish oil, like really high EPA, really high DPA, and really high PRMs, these are all derivatives of omega fatty acids, actually really help with that whole pathway as well. So if you're somebody that struggled with lots of inflammatory conditions for years, and now you're finally getting symptom relief by changing your diet, you want to really repair all of that long-term damage that's occurred, and the additions you would add in there are the IgG and the Mega Omega. Everyone else can do the probiotic, prebiotic. Just between those two alone, you're making massive changes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just anecdotally from some of my clients, some people just start the probiotic and immediately they don't have runs, just food intolerances. And then some people, they take the Megaspore and then they start to have really excessive bloat. And I've learned ever since, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that it may be a lot of the, the bad gut bugs dying and then releasing LPS. And then I didn't know what to do. So I was just like, oh, well, just give it time and you'll feel, because some people are like, I feel 4 months pregnant,
Right.
megaspores. And then I learned of IgG and how it can help kind of release the LPS, because ever since then, I've learned that basically if you don't remove the LPS that are kind of circulating, they could kind of get absorbed back in.
Yeah.
So that's where I've really found that IgG has helped a lot, kind of shuttle, things where they should go. And in terms of Mega Omega, I've become a fan because, it's interesting, but although my clients are very meat focused, a lot of them are essential fatty acid deficient. So even though they're eating a lot of fat, they are deficient in these areas based on certain symptoms and other, ways that we test. And so we need to make sure while they're healing their gut that they can even absorb these fish oils. And so sometimes the supplements don't work. And so I love that you guys have paired gut healing with absorption of fatty acids. And that's, essentially a more surefire way that the fish oil will not only get absorbed, but also, while it's also helping healing the gut. So
yeah, and get utilized. And one of the things we found that is really underutilized in the whole fish oil market that actually enhances the absorption and utilization of EPA, DHA, and all the derivatives is DPA. That's the whole purpose of DPA, is it actually enhances the absorption and utilization. So we were like, so many fish oils are so inadequate in DPA or don't add it at all. So we put a clinically relevant amount of DPA in there so that you can actually utilize it. And then, like you said, because the probiotics and everything else are bringing down the inflammatory response already, then it actually gives you better opportunity to utilize all of the benefit of the omega fatty acids. So yeah, we can't emphasize enough how important it is for gut healing to have those essential fatty acids involved. And those are extremely powerful. The studies are really strong.
One last question I have is, a lot of people are stressed in our society, right? And then stress causes like your endocrine system to kind of overreact, and then it can also even do more gut impermeability. Would you recommend like Megaspore just for even like stress, and how can we support the gut when we are stressed? I mean, obviously we should remove the stressor, but is there a certain type of supplement that you recommend for just kind of being overly stressed?
Yeah, so a 2015 publication in the Frontiers of Immunology showed that stress was likely one of the biggest drivers of intestinal permeability.
Right.
And this was a big review paper, right? So this is modern day stress, this anxiety and depression and things that we have, stress around work and life and so on. That stress is driving permeability and LPS translocation more than anything else. They equated it to be more than antibiotic use, more than poor diets and so on. It's stress. And so the really important thing is that the spores work against that permeability. So it's extremely important to do all the things you can do to manage your stress, right? The meditation, the vagal stimulation, all of that stuff, the mindfulness work becomes really important to try to bring down the stress. But the consequence of stress is permeability. And that's how stress makes you sick. And so if you can stop the permeability, then at least you're not getting the real negative consequence of the stress, right? So the spores become extremely important in that regard. You'll also start to find then that because spores increase the production of serotonin and dopamine and so on, that you'll actually start to feel a little bit better and alleviated. We actually had a couple of primary care docs here in the Chicago area that use Megaspore as their primary way of managing their anxiety patients. Because it can work so well when you start changing the gut. The things that normally would stress you to a significant level actually become less stressful in itself, right? So it's this two-way street. It's like your gut is messed up, so it makes you more susceptible to stress response. And because you're more susceptible to stress response, your gut gets even more messed up, right? So it keeps feeding each other. So it becomes really important to start getting the gut part under control, working on your mindfulness, and then between the two, you'll find a really good, healthy balance.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it's this vicious cycle, right? You have to
It is.
work on both, and I mean that's really good. Where can people find you? I know you've been on so many podcasts and interviews and have so much helpful information out there, but if people wanted to do a little bit more research and learn more from you, where can they find you?
Sure, yeah. So, come visit our site, microbiomelabs with an s.com. We have lots of webinars and write-ups and papers and all that stuff on there. So lots of places to learn there. If you go on YouTube and then you just type in my name, Kiran Krishnan, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of videos that other people have very kindly uploaded from interviews like this that I've done on very specific topics. I did a whole microbiome series for a couple years for another group, and every presentation was very specific on a very specific topic of the microbiome, like microbiome and autoimmune disease, microbiome and mood, microbiome and weight management. We dug really deep into each of those topics. So you'll find all those kind of things put up there for free. So those are the best places. And if anyone has any questions, I still try to engage with people as much as I can one-on-one on social media. So if you send me a message on either Instagram or Facebook, I try to respond to most messages. Sometimes there's big floods of messages and they get buried, but I do try to respond to people so I can try to engage with them.
Okay, and I'll add a few sites and your Instagram and Facebook in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
This has been extremely helpful, and I really appreciate all your knowledge and being able to cite studies that probiotics aren't a joke, and that gut healing is it can be really simple, but you need to focus on gut healing, and it's not just that you just have an elimination diet which seems to heal everything when it might just be that everything's dormant.
Yeah. Exactly, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I think this message is really important, and I think it'll really impact a lot of people. Ultimately, what we want is people to have a higher degree of resilience, right? That resilience in your gut is going to indicate health and wellness, and you'll see the beneficial impact of that down the road as you go along. So thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate the time to be able to talk.
No, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon, Christian.
Bye.